Hello, and thank you for joining me. You ever go to take a photo, you look back, and it's a little blurry, or it's a little fuzzy, it's really not quite what you were looking for? Well, in this video, I'm going to show you a few ways to get the most out of your camera phone, and how to go into a setting and take photos exactly the way that you want to. Now, I'm a professional photographer with about 3 years of experience, and I'm very confident that by the end of this video, you're going to be able to take photos exactly the way that you want to, and you're going to have a better understanding of camera sensors, ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, your camera sensor is what controls the sensitivity of light on your camera to let light go through and gather all the information. Whenever you take a photo, all the light that's gathered outside or wherever you're in, that is what accounts for the image that you're taking, and that is what goes on to your camera sensor. Your camera sensor is the new film, as they say, for cameras when it comes to old times when they used to use film to take photos and the light was recorded onto the film, and then you would have to develop it to get the images that you produce. But now, going to the 21st century, we have digital cameras and they have camera sensors, and those camera sensors is what allows you to take a photo digitally and get that information instantly and see exactly what the photo you took right away. Now, camera sensitivity for that camera sensor is controlled by ISO. ISO is what controls how much light is going to your camera sensor when your shutter speed and your aperture is open when you go to take an image. And we'll get into those later. So when you're outside and you're going to take a photo, you generally want to have an ISO setting of very low sensitivity so that the least amount of light goes through to your camera sensor. So if it's very bright outside, generally you want to start at about 50 to 100 ISO. But if it's darker, then at that point you want to raise it up anywhere from 200 to 800. Now I do recommend not going above 800 ISO, because once you go above 800 ISO, that's where a lot of grain and noise gets introduced to your photos, and that's where they start to look bad. Now, let's say you're inside, you're trying to take a photo, or you're outside and you're trying to take a photo and it's very dark, and you've increased your ISO all the way up to 800. You have as much light as you can possibly add to the situation, and it's not going to get any brighter. At that point, you would need to change your shutter speed. And you would need to lower your shutter speed so that more light goes through once your shutter opens, so that you can have a clearer image at that point. So now that you have a better understanding of camera sensors and ISO, let me get into shutter speed. So like I said before, shutter speed controls how much light goes to your camera sensor in a certain amount of time. So the longer your shutter stays open, the more light goes through, and the shorter your shutter stays open, the less light goes through. So when you're outside, you generally want to have a fast shutter speed, and when you're inside, you generally want to have a low shutter speed. Now, if you're trying to take a photo of an object, and let's say that object isn't moving, that's generally where you want to have a low shutter speed also. Let's say you're trying to take a photo of an object, and that object is moving, that's where you want to have a fast shutter speed, because shutter speed also accounts for movement. So when you're going to take a photo, and you're going to take a photo handheld, you always want to make sure that you have a photo shutter speed. You always want to make sure that your shutter speed is around 1/25. At 1/25, that means 1/25 of a second, your shutter speed is going to stay open to let that light come in and hit your camera sensor. So when you go to take a photo, like I said before, at 1/25, that accounts for the least amount of movement that you're going to produce while you're taking a photo handheld. But if you're going to take a photo and 1/25 still accounts for your photo to be darker, at that point you would want to increase your shutter speed to a slower shutter speed time, like 1 second or even up to 30 seconds, depending on how dark the setting is. If you're trying to take low light photography, or if it's very, very dark outside, at that point that's where you want to have shutter speeds anywhere from 1 to 30 seconds, depending on what your setting is. Now, when you're trying to take a photo of an object, you generally want to make sure that you have a fast shutter speed if it's moving and a slow shutter speed if it's not moving. But let's say no matter whether it's moving or it's not moving, you want to take a photo and it's not in focus. At that point, that's where it counts for depth of field, and depth of field is controlled by your aperture. So now I'm going to talk about aperture so that you have a better understanding of how to use that and how to control that when going to take a photo. So whenever you go to take a photo, and you take a photo of something like a person, you want to make sure that you have a very low depth of field or a shallow depth of field so that that person is completely in focus and everything else is out of focus. And let's say you're trying to take a photo of a group of people, or let's say you're trying to take a photo of multiple objects or of a landscape or of a town or something. At that point, you want to make sure that you have a very narrow or wide depth of field, because at that point, when you have a very narrow or wide depth of field, that accounts for everything to be very crisp and clear when you're taking that photo for your images. So if you're outside, generally it's very good to have a very narrow depth of field if you're trying to take a photo of landscapes or if you're trying to take photos of buildings, because at that point everything's going to be in focus and you're going to have a very narrow depth of field and less light is going to go through. So when you talk about depth of field and narrow or wide, what I'm talking about is the aperture ring inside your camera lens. Now, when it's narrow, it's more closed, and when it's wide, it's more open. So when you go to take a photo of something, like I said before, if you're taking a photo of a single subject, you do want to make sure that you have a very shallow depth of field and that your aperture is wide open. So generally, when you're taking a photo outside and you're trying to take a photo of someone, you do want to have a very low depth of field with a high shutter speed and a low ISO of around 100. But let's say you're inside, you're trying to take a photo of an object, or it's multiple objects. At that point, you do want to have a lower shutter speed and you want to have an ISO setting that's higher. So if you're at a setting and you're trying to take a photo of multiple objects and you don't need a fast shutter speed and your ISO is very low, at that point what you would want to do is you want to have a very narrow depth of field and you want to make sure that your aperture is very low. Now all of that is controlled by what is called a f-stop. Now f-stops is a camera setting that you see on your phone and refers to decimal numbers like 1.2, 1.4, 1.6, 2.1, 2.4, 2.6, and so on. And when you see these numbers, that is accounting for how narrow or wide open your depth of field is for your photo. So like I said, when you're trying to take a photo of a person, you want to have a very wide depth of field, a very shallow depth of field. So you do want to make sure that you have an aperture f-stop setting of around 1.2 or 1.4, depending on what it is that you're trying to take a photo of and what you're trying to have in focus. But if you are trying to take a group photo or you're trying to take photos of landscape, that's where you generally want to have an f-stop around 4 or anyway up to 7. Now when you do have a f-stop around 4 to 7, your aperture is going to be more narrow, and that's going to allow less light to go through your camera lens and hit your camera sensor. So like I said before, that's generally where you want to change your shutter speed and your ISO. Now that you have a better understanding of your ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture, go ahead and go to your phone and see how to get these settings so that you can get the most out of your camera phone. But let's say you don't have a phone that allows you to access these settings, you don't have to worry, because there are actually a few apps out there that unlock these settings out of your camera phone so that you can access those right away. Now if you have an Android phone, I would recommend downloading the DSLR HD camera app. It's free in the Android market, and that will allow you to get the most out of your camera phone and allow you to access those features that I was just talking about. If you have an Apple phone, I would recommend downloading the DSLR camera app. It's 99 cents in the app market, and like I said, that will allow you to get all of those features too. But if you do have the latest iPhone or the latest Samsung Galaxy or any of the latest flagship phones from any of the major brands, you will be able to access what is called Pro Camera or Pro Video mode, and these features will be completely available in those settings. So when you do go to your phone, it automatically defaults to the auto camera mode, but you do want to make sure that you go to more settings and access your pro camera mode so that you can access those settings like aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Now, again, like I said before, every single situation is different depending on the setting that you're in, and when you do go into these settings, you do have to tweak each one of these settings depending on where you're at. But like I said, depending on what type of setting that you're in, you do know exactly now what you're going to need to get the type of photo that you want. So just to recap on what we said here before, like I said, if you're going to take a photo of a moving object, you do want to have a very fast shutter speed. If you're taking a photo of an object that is not moving, you want to have a low shutter speed. Generally outside, you want to have a fast ISO. Generally when you're outside, you do want to have a low sensitivity of ISO anywhere from 50 to 100. And when you're inside or it's darker settings, you do want to go up to about 100 to 800. But again, over 800, that's where grain and noise gets introduced to your photos, and that's where they can look very bad. So try to adjust your shutter speed or your aperture at that point. Now again, aperture controls your depth of field, and that controls how much light goes through your camera lens. So when you're going to take a photo of a subject, you do want to make sure that you have a very shallow depth of field. But when you're going to take a photo of a landscape or multiple objects, you do want to make sure that you have a very wide depth of field, or that the aperture is very narrow. And again, that is controlled by your f-stops. When you go into your phone and you download those apps, or when you go into your pro camera mode, you will see a setting that says ISO, another setting that has a number with a fraction. That number with a fraction is going to be your shutter speed. Like I said, 1/25 means 1/25 of a second, and that is the lowest that you can go when trying to handheld the camera and take a photo. If you're going to go any lower than that, please use a tripod so that you can use so that you can get the best quality photo trying to take that. And then when you are taking a photo, also account for what you want in focus with your depth of field and open up your aperture or close it. I do want to thank you for joining me here today. Again, my name is Victor, and you have a wonderful evening.